I have a couple of crazy questions for you. Imagine you live beside the bank, and one day you go down the cellar of your house and you notice a little doorway that goes in towards the bank that you haven't really noticed before. And you go through it, and it brings you into the bank vault. And as you look around, you notice there are no cameras. No one knows anything about this. And you have a nosy around, and you see there's about £2 million sitting there. What do you do? Now, my other crazy question is about an old man. He's 85. His wife comes to you, she's 80. She says, look, for 60 years, this guy has made my life miserable. He's abused me, he's abused the kids. He's a violent, arrogant, deceitful man. I just need a few years' peace before I go. And she says, I'll give you £1 million if you put cyanide in his coffee. What will you do? You know, we get so many different answers to this question as well. Some people say, look, you know what, I'll do it for free. What would your answer be? The thing about it is, we all know that there's right and wrong. We all know that some things are right and some things are wrong. But we disagree on the specifics, on what those right things are, on what the wrong things are. There's only one way we can know if there is really right or wrong. And that is if there is an external source to tell us. That is, if God exists and if he has spoken. And now my next question is very simply, what do you think? Does God exist? Yes? No? Maybe? But whatever your answer, could we just suppose for the next couple of minutes that God does exist? It's not hard to do. You can always go back to atheism or whatever, agnosticism, later on if you want. But let's say God does exist. Did you know that God has a test? He gives it to you at birth. It's called your conscience, but we get fairly hard of hearing fairly early on, and we tend to ignore our conscience a lot. But because God knows what we're like, he also wrote down his test about 3,500 years ago. And you can see what you're like according to his test if you have a brief look. Of course, I'm talking about the test I'm sure you've heard of before, and that is the Ten Commandments. When we look at God's law, we see what we're like. That's the idea, is to show us what we're like. It's not if you keep it all, you'll earn your way to God's good books. That's not the idea at all. For example, one would be, you shall not lie. Have you ever told a lie? What do you call someone who tells lies? Liar. Another one is, you shall not steal. Most people feel pretty good about this, and they say, well, I've never stolen anything. I've never robbed the bank. But we're not talking about the bank here. We're talking about just taking something that doesn't belong to you. Like a paperclip, time off work maybe, tax, pencil, biscuit, 2p out of your mommy's purse. What do you call someone who steals things? Another one is, you shall not take God's name in vain. Have you ever misused God's name? Have you ever said, OMG? Have you ever used the name Jesus in a way that was derogatory? Because God says he will not hold guiltless anyone who misuses his name. What about you? Another one is, you shall honor your parents. You ever disobey your parents? Yeah, and that's being rebellious, and that's what we are. He says, you shall not murder. Have you ever murdered anyone? And I'm sure you say no, and that's good. I'm glad about that. But Jesus says that the murderer will come into judgment. He says, but I tell you that if you have anger in your heart towards your brother, you come under the same judgment as a murderer. Have you ever been angry with someone in your heart? See, it's the heart that God is interested in. The question now is, how have you done on his test? Are you guilty or innocent, according to his standard, not yours? What does a good judge do with a guilty person? He sentences them. And there's no point in going up to the judge and saying, "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean it. Please forgive me." That's not going to influence a judge. You're guilty, you've broken the law, there must be punishment. So what's the punishment for breaking God's law? The penalty for our rebellion is eternity in hell, in fire, in torment, in agony, alone in the dark. That is the penalty for breaking God's law. That is the penalty for rejecting him as our king. How are we going to get out of this situation? What's the way out? There is a way out. And God has done it for us. God became one of us. He became a man 2,000 years ago in the person of Jesus. Had a very special birth. He turned water, ordinary water, into wine, fine wine. He healed people. He made blind people see, mute people speak, deaf people hear. Crippled people walk. The incurable he healed. He walked on water. He calmed the storm. He fed thousands with a handful. He even raised the dead to demonstrate that he was no ordinary person, that he in fact is the Creator God. And then to release us from our problem, Jesus was crucified on a wooden cross for your guilt and mine. He went on the cross and he gave his life for yours, because the penalty for our rebellion is death. And on top of the cross, Pilate fixed a notice that says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And that's who he is. He is the King. The Jews at the time were very unhappy with this, and they said, "No, don't put up that he is the King of the Jews, but that he claimed to be." And they didn't want him ruling over them. And that's essentially what our rebellion, our crime, our treason, our sin is. It is that we don't want him ruling over us. We want to be in charge. Well, everybody dies. So what? Well, they took Jesus' body off the cross and they put it in a tomb. And the Jews said to the Romans, "Look, you better put a guard on this tomb, because he claimed he was going to rise on the third day. And if the body goes missing, we're in trouble." So the Romans put a guard on the tomb and sealed it. And on the third day, there was an earthquake and angels appeared, and the guard did a runner because they were terrified. And the women went to the tomb to embalm the body, and Jesus was not there. And the angel said, "He's not here. He's alive." And the tomb was empty. So what does this mean? Well, it means that what Jesus said was true, doesn't it? It means that if Jesus really rose from the dead, it must all be true. If he didn't, well, it's just a lie. Just ignore it all. But if he really rose from the dead, this must all be true. The water and the wine, the healing people, the walking on water, all of that must be true. And we need to listen to him. It means we need to listen. You know, not everybody rises from the dead like that. In fact, nobody does. It means death is not the end. No, death is not the end, because someone came back, didn't he? To show us death is not the end. But it also means more. When Jesus died on the cross, he paid for our guilt. But it leaves us with nothing. When he rose from the dead, when he came back from the dead, he credits everyone who believes him, who believes that he's been raised from the dead, he credits with his goodness. He gives his goodness to that person because they believe him, not because they're good enough. No one's good enough. He has a new life, and he'll give you a new life if you'll turn to him. What do we do about this? Well, very simply, we need to turn to him as our king. Give up wanting to be king ourselves and give him the crown of our life, our authority. And the other thing we need to do is we need to trust in him like you would trust in a parachute if you were to jump out of an airplane. I've met some people who have been mad enough to jump out of airplanes, perfectly good airplanes, with a parachute. And they have total trust in the ability of that parachute to keep them alive. They put it on and they jump. And we need to put Jesus on like you'd put on a parachute. And trust him. And then you will stand before God without guilt and with the goodness of Jesus. Simply by turning to him as our King and trusting in him like you would trust a parachute if you had to jump out of a plane. So what age will you be when you die? You know what? We never know what age we're going to be. Some people get advanced warning, but usually not very much advanced warning. All we know is it's going to happen. And I want to encourage you now to take very seriously what I've shared with you. Think about it. Think about this Jesus. It's all about him. You and him. He is the King. Will you turn to him as King? There's new life waiting for you. This is good news. You can stand before God without guilt in the goodness of Jesus and walk with him, because he will put his Spirit in you the moment you do this, and he'll give you a new life and a new hope, and he will help you to live a different life, and your life will change. He does promise you that while your life changes, some people are not going to like it. You're going to face persecution. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. But I tell you this, after walking with Jesus for more than 30 years, I don't regret a moment. Think about this. Put your trust in Jesus. Turn to him as your King. This is his command. Thanks very much for listening. May God bless you. May you come to know him and rejoice in him, because he just is absolutely brilliant. There's no one like him.